Hello and welcome back to Invictus. Konnichiwa, annyeonghaseyo, bonjour. How do you feel about languages in your games? Myself, I love languages. I have loved them for years. I know how to greet people in about 25 languages. It's really a lot of fun. I only speak one, almost two languages. But the point is, I love languages. And I've always enjoyed them, at least in theory, in my role-playing games. But I've run into a lot of issues. And that is, they tend to leave people out. Which, if you think about it, is kind of the point of them, right? I had an experience a number of years ago where I was in a biophysics workshop in France, and it was really interesting. We had people from all across the world there, mostly Europe, but all across the world there. And as the groups would coalesce, the languages being spoken would change. So you might have a few people together speaking German, and a couple of people who knew some German would participate. Depending, maybe there's people in the host country that we were at would start speaking French. But the language was fluid based on whoever was there. And it was fascinating. The Americans would sort of stand off to the side. Most of us only spoke English. And we would not really be able to participate. And also sticking off to the side largely was the French, because they only spoke French or only spoke English, at least, those that were at our workshop. But it was fun to watch the languages shift and change based on who was in those discussions. And in role-playing games, I've always imagined similar things happen. You get a couple of dwarves together, they're speaking Dwarvish, someone else comes up, they're speaking Common. What I hate, however, in games is the idea that there is one universal language that everyone in the entire world speaks. It just is really immersion breaking for me. But at the same time, it solves a huge problem. What is the problem that it's solving? Well, if let's say you're playing a game and you've got just two players, and you give a secret message to one of those players, what are they going to do? Well, if you as the game master say, "Hey Tom, this is the message," Tom turns to Fred and says what he said. Right? And so what's going on there? You're speaking to the first player and you're telling them something that you want them to hear, and you only want them to hear. Now, because you're sitting at a table and you don't want to let the other person or cut the other person out, you tell the one of them. But what you're really hoping is that first player will reflect what you've just told them in their character's voice. Right? You can imagine you and two other people sitting at a table and you whisper into one person's ear, and then they say what you said. It's going to change, right? It's going to change based on who just heard what. And the same thing, in my opinion, should be true in role-playing games. So if you're talking to one character and you tell them something, and they say something, it should be in character. But that's not often what happens, right? What often happens is the first player turns to the other players and says, "Well, you heard what he said. I tell them that." And that's just kind of a boring result. But it happens pretty much anytime you give secret information. And if you give a player a note, like you were, working ahead of time, you wrote a little note and you gave it to them, they will just read that note to everybody else. Which again, as the game master, I could have done that. So languages often, to me, in games tend to be a disappointment. But at the same time, having a universal language that literally everyone in the world speaks is kind of a disappointment. English is becoming that language, but it's still not, right? There's still a lot of places in the world that you can go and you try to speak English and no one's going to understand you. But a lot of fiction deals with this in different ways. There was a show, Stargate, which I'm assuming everyone's heard of, right? If you haven't, what are you doing? Right? Stargate had this famous problem where everyone spoke English. And it didn't make any sense, right? The idea was like all humans originated somehow on Earth a long time ago, went all across the galaxy, all these different cultures, but somehow in the year, 1998 or 2005 or whatever year the show was happening at the time, everybody speaks English. And as you watch the show, it kind of irritates you. And the show even makes fun of itself from time to time by bringing up the fact in some sort of satirical way that everybody speaks English, and kind of wonders, why is that the case? But from a filmmaking point of view, right, it would have been terrible for the plots if they didn't. What do I mean by that? Well, you would have had some part of every episode where one of the characters had to figure out what language everyone's speaking, how they can translate with them, and what they needed to do going forward. And it would eat precious airtime every single episode trying to figure out how to speak with these new people. And so the show writers just said, we're not going to deal with it. We're just not. In many ways, games of Dungeons and Dragons are the same. Everybody speaks the same language. And this is common. And then sometimes you can have your secret side-coded message if someone speaks one of the other languages that you do. In my own game of Invictus, I've tried to take a different approach to this. Instead of there being like a universal common language that everyone speaks, there are regional languages. And then if you're in region A and you go to region B, you can have limited conversation with those people because language shifts subtly kind of as you go. But the main problem is it excludes people during the play session. And this is an open problem, and I don't know how to solve it. I really have no idea. That's kind of why I'm making this video is, what are your thoughts on languages? Should we have separate regional languages? Should we have separate, quote, racial or species languages? How should that work? Not having it, to me, seems like a huge loss. But at the same time, it just creates awkwardness when you're sitting around and playing. Because you have to go, okay, who speaks, Goblin? Who speaks Orc? Who speaks, Elvish or whatnot? As everyone's sort of staring at their character sheet quickly to figure out, do I speak that language or not? And one person goes, oh, I do. And then you say, okay, John, you hear the following conversation being had. And then John will say, okay, I tell my friends that. And at that point, you're like, well, why did I waste time asking who spoke it? Why did I waste time doing that? Because that's not really the experience that we want. We want to make that character feel special because they chose that background language or whatnot. And then we want that character to express that to the party. But I don't really have a good way of doing this. Do you? Have you seen any games that do it well? A lot of games take cop-outs. One of my favorite games that most of you probably never heard of is called Wraith. And I love Wraith. It is, a World of Darkness game. And basically there's this huge land of the dead. And you think about it, wow, that's got to be hard, right? You've got people that died 2,000 years ago, people that died last week. How do they communicate with one another? Well, in this game that's so full of depth and culture and richness, they have a universal language of the dead, and everybody speaks it. And you say, well, I guess if everybody's dead, what's the problem? But I still love languages. I want there to be languages in our games. I just don't know how to do it in a way that is going to be interesting for others. I don't know how to do it without wasting a bunch of time at the table. And so that's really my question for you. How do you do languages at your table? Do you have a way that you can talk about, can give information to one player so they're not just saying, I say what he said? How do you do it? I'd like to hear it. This is just meant to be a short video today, sort of talking about languages. What do we do? How do we bring them into our games? And how do we handle them? I'm going to be really curious to see if my own solution for my game Invictus is going to work. And that is, we have regional languages. And if you are in a region nearby and you're speaking that regional language, you have some intermittent conversation. So I can say to a player, you believe he's asking you the following. And what that's going to do in some sense is allow everyone to participate in that conversation, but have to figure out what's really being communicated. Now, if you want to play a game where everyone just sits down, you kick in the door and you go to fighting, you probably don't care what languages people speak, right? I don't know how Draw Steel handled it, but I remember they were talking about having different levels of language proficiency. And at the time I thought, wow, how's that going to fit with a game that you're kicking in the door, and if someone's on the other side, you're literally throwing them across the room, and you're having some big battles. Are people going to want to do that? So I still need to look into what they did. But I know other games have handled languages differently. And some just say, here's a list. Here's a list of languages that you speak, right? I haven't played enough Call of Cthulhu to whereas it really matters necessarily what languages. Either you speak some modern-day language overlap or, some ancient Cthulhuan language. But I know other games do this, and I know other games have done it well. So if you can point me to something, I'd love to hear about it. If you're a game designer and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with your languages, I'd love to hear what your solutions are. Please share them down below. Come join us over on Discord and whatever. Hey, It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for listening tonight. Goodbye for now.